Okay, so we'll get going with session 3. So our first speaker is Dr. Gary Hack, who we know from this morning. Gary's a human ecologist and a senior research associate at the Stockholm Environment Institute at the University of York, UK. Gary has worked on a wide range of interdisciplinary environmental projects in transport, climate change, and air pollution at the local and international level. He has a particular interest in human behavior in the environment. Gary has led a number of climate change communication and social marketing initiatives to achieve community behavioral change. He was one of the first academics in the UK to examine the issue of an aging population and climate change, and has produced a number of reports on this subject. He regularly writes for the UK press and has appeared on BBC radio and TV news and discussion programs. He's got a new book coming out later this year called Environmentalism Since 1945. It's a real pleasure to have you here, Gary.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to, I think I'm probably one of the most excited people when it comes to this conference, because we held a similar conference in a workshop on a smaller scale in 2008. And then when I was talking about older people and climate change, it was actually very difficult to get people to come along to that workshop, especially in the older people sector, because they thought, rightly I guess, at that time, the main issues for older people were healthcare or pensions or fuel poverty. But obviously since then things have changed. So as Heather said, I work for the Stockholm Environment Institute. If you've never heard of us, we're an international environment and development institute. We have our head offices in Stockholm, in Sweden. We have an office in Africa, in Tanzania, in Thailand, in Bangkok, in the US, in Boston, and in Estonia, in Tallinn, and in the UK. And our mission is to bridge the gap between science and policy to achieve change for a better, more sustainable future. So most of the work that we do is related to the policy process to try and have impact and to change the situation, and hopefully for the better. I would like to talk about this afternoon environmental attitudes and behaviour of older people when it comes to climate change, and to some initiatives that we've done at the SCI and also other initiatives in the UK that have attempted to engage older people on the climate change issue, especially as, and then we'll make some recommendations. So when we look at older people and climate change, we came up with this triangle to have a kind of much more holistic approach. So it's very easy to see older people purely as a vulnerable group. But what we have to, if we really want to understand older people and climate change, we have to look at the three aspects of the triangle. First of all, their contribution to the problem in terms of their lifestyle choices and their carbon emissions. Obviously, being a casualty, a vulnerable group, how they'll be impacted by the problem, and how they can be a champion, how can they be a force for change to tackle climate change. As I said, we started in 2007 with this first report. We were undertaking a project called Climate Talk 50+, engaging older people on climate change and raising awareness. And we looked at the carbon footprint of older people, age-related carbon footprint and attitudes, and we produced this report in 2007. The following year, I realised that when we did that report that nobody was talking about these two issues, an ageing population, a changing climate. And we already had evidence from the heat wave, have been mentioned earlier this morning in France, that older people will be impacted. So in 2008, in collaboration with Help the Ages, we held the first national workshop on older people and climate change, and we tried to get a number of stakeholders together. For that workshop, and out of that workshop we produced this report which tries to really scope out the problem and summarises all the kind of issues, and I'm pleased that lots of the issues have been brought up here today, this morning. And in addition, we produced this policy brief and we sent it to every relevant UK minister to try and raise the profile of this issue, older people and climate change. And as I said this morning, I think it's really important, and meetings like this is contributing to raise the profile of the issue on the political agenda. And finally, our recent report, in collaboration with the Retired Senior Volunteer Programme, we did this report on how to engage older people in climate change. So that's really a bit about the history of what we've been doing. So when we come to talk about attitudes and behaviour, because we're an interdisciplinary group, I thought I'd just define what I mean. Environmental attitudes is beliefs, opinions, and feelings about the environment and environmental issues. And obviously behaviour is an action that you deliberately do to protect the environment. And with the whole psychology of behavioural change, what it says is that before somebody's willing to take action, before someone is willing to do something, especially when it comes to the environment, they need to realise or recognise that that issue is important. So in 2007, when awareness of climate change was just, in the UK at least, was just coming up the agenda, we did a whole programme of awareness raising to highlight the different groups the importance of climate change, with the idea that hopefully that if they embrace and think climate change is a real threat, then they would then be willing to undertake greener behaviours. So sometimes we have a very pro-environmental attitude, and we think the environment's great, but we don't necessarily translate that into action, and that's where you have the value-action gap. People think, you ask people, is it great to protect the environment? Yes. Will you be going on holiday to Thailand next year to go on the beach? Yes. So it actually doesn't match, and that's the area for behavioural kind of initiatives, is to try and reduce that value-action gap. So we took a survey of attitudes in 2007-08, but this is a more recent one that was undertaken in 2010 for the University of Cardiff, and they allowed us access to the data. It wasn't focused purely on older people, but we were able to gain some kind of attitudes by age. And as you can see, a proportion of older people over 55 still think that climate change is a natural process. There is concern, and I think that's been recognised in other surveys, that concern in this age group of climate change is increasing or is high. However, as you get older, we found out that certain members of this age group are not very concerned, and you can see there 36%. But when it comes to whether they can actually do anything about the issue and whether they'd be willing to take action, I won't read it all out, you can just see the figures. So, which is not surprising. As people get older, they find it increasingly unable to take action, or they don't feel that they can make a difference, and basically it's out of their control. We've talked this morning a lot about adaptation and mitigation. Obviously, this is part of the mitigation side of the coin, but it also relates to what people think about climate change, whether climate change is important, and also whether, if they don't believe in climate change, then maybe they will not be responsive to the kind of messages when we talk about heat waves or any other climate-related information, for example. We also undertook some focus groups, and this was back in 2008, but the general kind of issues that people brought up is that as I said, there is a concern in this demographic group that climate change is important. They are motivated to do something about it, and especially the older generation, 70s plus, who were brought up during the war, they don't like waste. So waste is not in their kind of mental makeup. So they're motivated to do something about it. Many of them do already recycle and do certain activities. They have a concern for their grandchildren and about how they're going to leave the planet for the future to them. But also they're frustrated. They're frustrated in the sense that they're making an effort, but maybe local government or national government are not doing as much as they could, or that there's messages the messages in some ways is not being communicated well. For example, they say switch off your light, but then they go into the city at night and see a building with all the lights left on, and they ask the question, why are you asking us to switch off our lights when these empty buildings still have the lights on? So it's about having a message that is communicated well and is implemented throughout all sectors. So in terms of the focus groups, in the kind of information we got about attitudes of older people to climate change, as I said, general concern, a demonstrable willingness, Many are already taking action, motivated and positive, and the issues that were important to them when it comes to taking action was public transport, energy conservation, and waste. So that's the attitudes of older people to climate change in that particular survey. And as I said, in order to have to create behavioural change for people to take pro-environmental changes, then you need to have the right attitude in terms of in what the environment, that climate change or the environment is important to them. When it comes to behaviour, we can measure that by the carbon footprint. And approximately 42% of UK carbon emissions come directly from individual actions. So it's the individual lifestyle choices that everyone makes in the UK has an impact. And here we took the carbon footprint, and it's very important, direct emissions and indirect emissions. That provides a much more comprehensive calculation of the carbon footprint, and it covers these areas: energy in the home, how people travel, the waste they produce, and the products they consume. And this gives you just an average of the carbon footprint of a UK resident from my home city of York. You see, housing and energy use is a big issue. Transport is a big issue when it comes to carbon emissions. So we calculated the carbon footprint of age-related emissions back in 2007-8, and this is what we found, that when it comes to age and age-related carbon emissions, we found that the baby boomers, 50 to 64, which we call baby boomers, has one of the highest carbon footprints, how this the consumption and their carbon footprint changes as people get older and into later life. So I think the main issues you need to consider here is to show you that as people get older, they obviously stay at home, then their carbon emissions is mainly from energy use, while, say, somebody, a baby boomer, who is much more active, they have a high proportion of their carbon footprint is from travel. And I'll be going in much more detail on Thursday about this. So we did this, and I think it just shows you how our consumption, our lifestyle choices at different age, stages of life impacts our contribution to the problem of climate change. And I think it's also important as where we can, when we come to mitigation, and I guess also adaptation, is where we can aim and reduce emissions so we don't have, for example, we know that if we're talking about the heat wave, and at the moment anyway in the UK, in winter, a high proportion of the carbon emissions is due to heat in the home. Maybe in the future that will be from cooling the home. And so therefore it's important with the technology that we be aware of the energy considerations of any new technologies that might allow adaptation to occur. So this is just a model that the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs uses on behavioural change. How do you engage people? How do you persuade them to break away from their habits, their high consuming or high carbon habits and lifestyles? And they call it the 3 E's: enable, engage, and amplify. So in terms of engage, you can engage at a more macro level, and that's, for example, in terms of the taxation system, rewards maybe at the national or regional level, but also at the local level, community action, local groups, local campaigns and networks. In terms of enable, you need to remove the barriers that prevent people from leading low-carbon lifestyles. So, for example, you may say use public transport, but if the public transport is not available, it doesn't operate in the local area of the person, or is expensive or inefficient, then people will not be willing to make that change in behaviour. And finally, to exemplify, to lead by example. And this is what I said about the energy policy, consistency in policies. Why ask me to switch my light off when you're not asking this office block with all the lights on at night and no one switched those lights off? So in terms of initiatives, I just wanted to give you a few ideas of the kind of initiatives that have been undertaken in the UK with regard to engaging older people on climate change issues. The first one is climate change and the over 50s, and that uses a kind of peer-to-peer interaction. And this is one of my colleagues from the retired seniors volunteer program, who helped me write the third report. He undertook this project, and he went round to different groups. He discussed climate change issues with the people. He interacted and provided information. And he felt that there was not enough information out there directed to this age group. The third one was sustainable living in the southeast, and that again was raising awareness of climate change, but also greener living, and interacting with individuals, providing information. And I think that was also in kind of groups. The third one, Evergreen Initiative, that was working with residents in retirement homes as groups, looking at recycling, growing food, and passing their knowledge on to younger people, for example, working with the schools. Another one is digital storytelling, and this is where they filmed older people's experiences and practices on film, and then that was used to communicate that to their age group and also to other age groups. So really crossing the kind of age divide. So I'm sure we'll hear more about the kind of activities that's done in your country or in Canada, but these are a few that's going on in the UK. So how am I doing for time? Yeah. Okay, so I just want to conclude. In terms of the initiatives, you can either work on an individual level or as a group level. I just completed this study, which was not aimed at this demographic group. It was more of a community level, called the York Green Neighbourhood Challenge. And that's where we went into a community and recruited from certain neighbourhoods a team to participate in this project. And the objectives of that was to have a measurable reduction in carbon emissions, to raise awareness, and to pilot a new approach, but also to foster community cohesion. We used a very targeted approach. So we did a map of the city. We looked at which neighbourhoods had a high carbon footprint using top-down data, which neighbourhoods had a high green attitude, and also the appropriate infrastructure, such as the housing stock and transport. And we targeted those neighbourhoods where most of the people thought the environment was important, but who had not translated that attitude into action, so they had a high carbon footprint. So they were receptive to receiving our message. They just needed a bit more encouragement and persuasion. We had 6 teams. Each team met once a month. They had a mentor. We had experts go and talk to them about energy efficiency, recycling, transport issues. And we achieved a reduction of about 10%. It was statistically significant, especially in the areas of food, housing, and shopping. And I think I'll just skip that. So what was successful from this approach was raising awareness of low-carbon lifestyles, achieving the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But more importantly, and it comes back to this issue that we discussed this morning, it created, for certain people in the neighbourhoods, they said it provided them with an opportunity to speak to their neighbour, to actually talk to their neighbour, to get to know their neighbour. So it provided community cohesion. So if we're looking into the future for initiatives of engaging communities, this could be one approach of working together. And the approach, it was a pilot study, and now we've extended that to 7 local authorities in North Yorkshire working in teams. But this time we're going to existing communities. For example, in York we're using a church team, which has a different, a diverse age group. So, yeah. Okay. I think I've got lots to tell you, but just to say that this report has recommendations on how better to engage older people, and that's available online. And I'll stop there. Sorry I spoke so quickly.
So our next speaker is Lisa Brown, Dr. Lisa Brown. Lisa is an associate professor in the Department of Aging and Mental Health Disparities, the College of Behavioral and Community Sciences at the University of South Florida in Tampa. Lisa's clinical and research focus is on aging, disasters, health, vulnerable populations, and long-term care. Since 2004, Lisa has studied the acute and long-term psychosocial reactions and consequences of natural and human-caused disasters. Her research efforts focus on disaster mental health literacy, psychological first aid, access and use of disaster mental health services, and the effects of disasters on vulnerable populations. Lisa.
Thank you, Heather, for the introduction. Can everybody hear me all right? Is this on?
There's a mute button.
A mute button. Okay. The kids probably wish I'd used that. Am I on now? No?
Yeah,
You can hear me, but no one else can. So if I project a little more, can you hear me now? Okay. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to go with this. So mine's going to shift a little bit more. Dr. Hack's enthusiasm for social marketing is shared by me. So I'm going to talk about social marketing a bit today first. And then I'm going to talk about an intervention now that's considered to be the gold standard in the United States called psychological first aid. So there's a distinction that's made between special needs shelters, and Michael mentioned the fact that that term's now going to be changed, and general public shelters. So a general public shelter is where the general public would go if they needed to seek shelter during some sort of a catastrophic event. And a special needs shelter has a higher level of care. Somebody who has a medical condition that warrants maybe air conditioning, maybe some sort of access to refrigerated treatments, or some sort of ability to get oxygen or electricity for maybe a motorized piece of equipment. So we look at older adults that need these types of services and the best way to do outreach to them and how to get them to enroll to use these services within their given community. And then psychological first aid, what is it and does it make a difference? So I want to start out first talking very briefly about disaster literacy. And as you can see, adults age 65 and older have the lowest literacy rates. And so this is really important. I think a lot of the materials that we prepare are written at a level that are too high for most older adults. And the thing to remember too is that we've got cohort effects. So obviously you can see this next cohort coming up is better educated, it's more literate than the current cohort. So it's very important to bear in mind who your audience is and what their reading level might be. And this becomes even more important if you're not looking at people who are English speaking. If there are people who have like Spanish as their native language and they're living in the country, or another foreign language and they're immigrants, that's something else that they may have a good command of the language in terms of speaking, but not a good command of the language in terms of reading. So it's very important to bear that in mind. Three types of literacy that we look at. We look at prose, which is the ability to read and comprehend documents with continuous text. So that's like newspaper articles and instructions and how to proceed. And then documents, and that's reading and understanding with non-continuous text, and that's maps and application forms. And then there's quantitative information about how to review a bill or balance a checkbook. And as you can see by looking at these three descriptors, all three of them are involved in terms of either preparing for or responding to a disaster. So you really need to be able to do these various activities at a fairly good level in order to keep yourself safe, and I'll go into that in a few seconds, or in order to receive services after an event. People have to be able to understand and then act on the written word. So they may be able to understand it, but if they don't have available resources, they can't go ahead and do those activities. And older adults are more likely to fall through the cracks than younger adults. So what we decided to do was we decided to test this document that one of the counties in Florida has prepared for using special needs shelter services. And we thought a great way to do that would be to take some graduate students who are interested in getting some research experience, and then we'd have them go over and talk to people who are in the waiting rooms, waiting to go in to have a medical checkup, because these are the people who would be most likely to use the special needs shelters. So we went in there, and we were really amazed because there was no incentive to participate. And they approached people, and they said, look, if you get called up and you have to go in, then that's fine. But we got over 400 people within a relatively short period of time, and people were actually we got close to 300 people, and people were very interested in participating. So hopefully you've had a chance to sort of read over this descriptor, since I'm not going to read it to you. One of the issues with this piece of material is that it's written both from the first and third person point of view, so it leaves something to be desired there. The grade level is 13.7 years. So it's been basically written for somebody who's completed at least 3 semesters of college-level courses. And it is pretty daunting. It was really in very small type. I actually enlarged the type because if you got it directly from the county, it's in small type. And they're still using this, by the way. And 50% of the document was written in the passive tense. So we got 299. What I did do is we delivered a reading test called the RAT. I wanted to make sure that people could actually read and that we weren't confounding reading inability with not able to understand the directions. And sure enough, we found that people could read. So that was reassuring that obviously the reading levels of these individuals was correlated with their educational level, which is what you would expect. We recorded the time to read the flyer. How long did it take them to read the flyer? And then they were asked 11 questions to evaluate their comprehension, their ability to use the EOC special needs shelter materials. And we asked them questions like, what was this article about? So it was just a broad, open-ended question. Just, what was this about? What did you just read about? How does a person qualify for special needs shelter services? What services are provided at a special needs shelter? Are you eligible for special needs shelter services? Why or why not? And so the person didn't give them the questionnaire. These questions were asked of them so that somebody else was doing the writing. Because a lot of times if people have to write out answers, they won't do them. Unless it's filling in bubbles or doing something really fast, people uniformly do not like to write. So we got really good, comprehensive, good answers to these questions. You can see here that most of the sample was white. It was pretty much an equal division between male and female. The average age of participant was 55 years, and most had some type of education. 24% had a 4-year degree, and 22% had a master's degree or higher. Now, I have to say this was done at our university clinic, so it may be that a better educated sample sought out clinical services at the university, so this is not necessarily representative of the broader sample because they're so highly educated. What was also interesting is that 80% were lifetime residents of Florida, which is unusually high because we're known for snowbirds, people that just come down for certain select months of the year and then they go to a cooler climate, and 95% were full-time residents. And what we found was that people had real problems, and there's more detail that I'd be happy to share with you during tomorrow's presentation, or if you want to ask me separately, but that people really struggled reading this brochure, that they had a hard time making sense of it. They had a hard time understanding what the instructions were. What made it even more interesting was that there was a date in there of June 5th that these applications were due by, and that was actually an artificial date because when we talked to the folks at the county, what happened is that they realized that there were more people in the county who were actually eligible for these special needs shelter services than beds available within the shelter. So they were sort of in this sort of position where they wanted to encourage people to use the shelter services, but they knew they didn't have enough services to offer them. And so there was kind of this pull, maybe not to make it the easiest thing in the world, which they succeeded at. The person that wrote this application is somebody who is a specialist in disaster preparedness, and they have expert knowledge. So it's not inaccurately written. It's just written in such a way where it's really difficult to understand what that person should be doing and how to use the services. The take-home message in all of this really is the pilot test, is that we don't get paid oftentimes with our budgets to be able to develop a product and then to go out later on and to say, look, before we print up 20,000 of these, let's have 2 focus groups read these through and let's see what kind of holes in understanding we have here. We don't have the funding to do that, or even if we do have the funding, sometimes it doesn't occur to certain groups to do that because, again, as we talked today earlier about the richness of having multiple disciplines represented at a given meeting, not everybody who's involved with disaster response knows about pilot testing. I mean, until I went to graduate school, I would have thought it was to learn how to fly an airplane. I wouldn't have thought it was, to go out and test materials. So, to their credit, I can understand why, and I think that, even if you get a public information officer who's well trained in terms of working with the media, they may not have this information available to them. And really, we need to have better ways to be able to get information out to our constituents that helps them to take appropriate action. The CDC has been doing a really great job, by the way, in my opinion, with doing social marketing, where they've been really sort of sensitive to this, and I think they're ahead of the curve in terms of a lot of the efforts that they've been putting out there. So I'm going to switch gears here really quickly, and I'm going to talk very briefly about psychological first aid. How am I doing on my time?
5 minutes.
Okay. I have a flyer here, so if you're interested, this is a document that we produced. It is free of charge. It's public domain. It's 126 pages, which is why I did not print them all up and bring them in here, so that, but I've got a flyer, and it's a little descriptor. So if you're interested, please feel free to pick one up, and you can print one out and learn more about psychological first aid. Psychological first aid was developed in 2006. SAMHSA decided that they were going to fund the National Center for PTSD, which is out of the VA, the Veterans Affairs Services, and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which is the organization that I think we should have a similar effort focused on older adults, that we should mirror their efforts in the U.S. And they funded this, and it's a really slick guide. You can also pull that one off the internet because it's in the public domain. But when I looked at it, it was for children and teens and healthy dwelling, middle-aged people receiving services in public shelters. There was little to nothing about older adults in their response effort and some of the issues that you may want to think about, everything from heat stroke to medication issues to mobility issues, nothing in there at all. So we got a small amount of money from Psychology Beyond Borders, and we developed this with a team of national and now international experts on older adults. And again, it was multidisciplinary, the team that helped to put it together. So it wasn't just me, I was the one that instigated it, but I had a whole group of people who really helped me pull the materials together in a way that was meaningful. Psychological first aid in the United States is now the standard intervention of choice in the immediate aftermath of a disaster by the American Red Cross and the Medical Reserve Corps. After psychological first aid comes crisis counseling. And crisis counseling, I'm just going to do one small plug here for crisis counseling. It's usually, again, funded by FEMA. Sometimes SAMHSA will do an additional funding. But the issue is that we market crisis counseling like psychotherapy. So you get very few people who are distressed using those services, the crisis therapy services, crisis counseling, even though they're free of charge, because they say, I don't have a problem with mental health. I'm not crazy. I'm having problems because of a disaster. I'm having problems because of, whatever took place. And if that hadn't happened, I'd be just fine. Psychological first aid is very similar to medical first aid. So you can teach a layperson how to deliver the intervention. And the thinking is that people are going to say something in response to someone else's distress. And it may not be always the appropriate thing. There have been times where perhaps somebody's lost somebody that they've loved, and you've been trying to offer words of comfort, and the wrong things come out of your mouth. That words are very powerful, and that's one of the challenges, unlike medical first aid, where I can teach you how to do a tourniquet and how to do CPR. Here, you're actually teaching somebody to have a different way of talking and interacting with someone else that would help to facilitate their coping and their recovery and build resilience. So we're trying to teach large numbers of people to use psychological first aid because we believe that by doing this type of intervention, that this will help to speed the recovery process and reduce the likelihood that people might go on later to develop depression or post-traumatic stress disorder or other types of behavioral problems. Here, I've got some definitions, thank you, that psychological first aid is an intervention. It is not a treatment. So the distinction's made in that intervention is dealing with a state. So it's not dealing with traits, your hardwiring. It's dealing with the temporary state of how you are. Where treatment would be delivered by someone who's licensed and someone who's had formalized education and the application of formal mental therapy, such as cognitive behavioral therapy. So that's sort of the distinction that's made. So here, some of the premises are first, do no harm. Guides people in what to say, what to do, what's usually helpful. It focuses on strengths rather than symptoms and deficits. So it's really looking at, You know, there must have been other times in your life where you dealt with a difficult situation. What were some of the things that worked for you? What were some of the things that made a difference, and how did you cope with that? And then once you learn that, then say, well, how would it be if you applied some of those techniques to this current situation? And oftentimes, people after a disaster, they're not thinking too clearly, and having somebody who's willing to sit down with you and kind of talk you through that process and find out what your comfort level is and what you're really capable of doing to help facilitate your own recovery, just getting that gentle support in the right direction can make a critical difference. These are the 8 core components. We've added 3 more core components to the second edition. We added one on everyday traumas because we found that people experience a lot of everyday traumas. And just like medical first aid, this works just as well for everyday traumas. We also added a section on palliative or comfort care, that we recognize that we might have people who are dying and that people don't know and may have a lot of discomfort about dealing with people who are dying. And it may be really crude, but if you've just got a couple of sheets of paper that give you some basic instructions on things that you might say that might be comforting and might be helpful, it's a whole lot better than nothing. So we added those sections. And then we added another section, a last section, on behavioral interventions, recognizing that not everybody may have the cognitive capacity. Some people may have Alzheimer's disease, some people may have mild cognitive impairment, and this would give somebody some types of approaches they could use to help that person in terms of their behaviors. So I'm going to end now because I know I'm coming to the end and I'm getting another little note here. But I would be happy to talk to anybody after my presentation or to give more information tomorrow. So thank you.
So our next speaker is George Tokeski. George is Senior Director of Community Relations at Hospice by the Sea, Inc., which is a not-for-profit, community-based provider of hospice and palliative care, caregiver support, bereavement, counseling, and home health agency services in South Florida. Another Florida person. In his position, George oversees the fund development and communications departments. He has over 15 years experience working in the healthcare industry and was previously Vice President of Community Care Services at Alzheimer's Community Care, Inc. From 1998 to 2005, George served at the Florida Department of Elder Affairs as a government operations consultant and as one of the agency's emergency coordinating officers. In this capacity, he worked directly with Florida's healthcare policies and regulations, specifically in the fields of housing, long-term care, and disaster recovery. He's had quite a bit of experience with the many hurricanes that have hit Florida over the last decade or so. And George was recruited and deployed as a member of the United States Administration on Aging Disaster Response Team. So George, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. This is working okay? Okay, great. Thank you, Heather, and thank you to everyone who was involved with putting on this week-long event. I really have to commend Canada in general. This is the 8th time I've traveled to Canada. I really consider Canada, and many of us do, as a leader in this topic, climate change, disasters, and aging. I think this is the one country that I've been to that has really taken it upon themselves to focus on this topic. As Heather said, my background kind of ranges from healthcare policy all the way through Alzheimer's and now hospice. But at one time I got very involved with disaster recovery because of my relationship with healthcare and long-term care as well as elder housing. When we had 7 hurricanes hit us within a 15-month period in the state of Florida, we had hundreds, and if not thousands, of seniors that were displaced. And tomorrow I'll talk a lot about individuals, not just seniors, but frail seniors and the impact that those storms and events had on them. But today I'm going to kind of talk a little bit more neutrally about older population and climate change in general. When I spoke to Heather initially, I talked to her a little bit more about my being more specific to disasters, but I think we're all in agreement. The climate is changing globally. We are going to see increased significant weather-related events. We know the population is aging, and therefore we are going to see much more elder individuals being at risk of harm or injury due to this change. I'm not sure if there's more up-to-date information, but just to give you an idea of the trends, from 96 to 2006, there were more people killed than the two previous decades due to disasters around the world. More than 2.5 billion people were affected in that time period. A little snapshot, 1995, $160 billion in damages, 161 million people affected. I was deployed for a total of 9 federally declared disasters, so a lot of my background comes from my personal experiences on the ground. But to give you an idea, and Mike brought this up earlier, if you look at the hurricanes, Hurricane Katrina in particular, and then I also went to Iowa to help the state of Iowa with flood recovery, you'll see that elders are disproportionately affected. In 2004, when we had 4 major hurricanes hit Florida and all 67 counties were declared a federal disaster, 27,000 plus homes were damaged or destroyed, uninhabitable. 1 in 5 were affected, and 30 to 50% of all the homes that were damaged or destroyed were owned by elder households. And that's significant. Florida has a population of about 22% over the age of 60, 65. Where Hurricane Charlie hit, the county specifically, 50% of that population over the age of 65. Hurricane Katrina, we watched it all play out on TV. 200,000 estimated nationally displaced seniors. Every state in the country seemed to have evacuees in it, and I believe that was a confirmed fact. I think all 50 states had evacuees from Hurricane Katrina. 1,500 plus deaths, and 70% were over the age of 60. In the Iowa floods, where a lot of homes were destroyed or completely uninhabitable, 28% of the Housing Assistance Program applications for FEMA, i.e. temporary housing and shelter, were made by elderly households. The impact on older populations, and I believe this is Hurricane Wilma, which pretty much covered the most populated sections of Florida. The impact on older populations is very clear. For years and years and years, all healthcare policies and regulations and all of our systems have been designed to push people out of institutional placement and back into the community. And to keep them in the community, they require essential services and various different things to maintain a life in their homes or in the community in general. When a hurricane or a disaster or weather-related event overtakes a community, it stops all of those services. You have a disruption of essential and life-sustaining services. Your emergency response systems, your hospitals, they become overloaded. That leads to delays in response, which leads to delays in help getting to the most frail and vulnerable populations, including the elderly. You have displaced individuals, and as the previous slides have indicated, elders were disproportionately represented in housing loss in previous disasters. Elders are often on fixed income, so they don't have the ability to go check into a hotel room and wait for their homes to be repaired. They're underinsured. They often are battling the decision between paying for medications or paying for having their house repaired after a disaster. Disaster-related crime. Gloria spoke about how when a disaster strikes, predators come out, and the most vulnerable are the people who need the help the most. And that's often our elderly population. And of course, there's a lot of stress, fear, and uncertainty, a lot of confusion, a lot of lack of information. And this all really does tax the elderly population quite a bit. And so when we look at how do we respond to this situation, how do we look forward, how do we make changes, how do we set policies to mitigate these types of scenarios happening, we kind of have to start with the beginning. And that's individual preparedness with older persons. The first thing that we kind of did was look at what are our barriers? What are the issues related to personal preparedness? And we found that there were many. Cultural differences. A storm hitting Miami versus a storm hitting Mississippi, the rural parts of Mississippi, the way people responded, the way people felt about preparing for it, completely different. Socio-economic status. You saw when Hurricane Katrina hit, the levees broke, the water came in. Who was left behind? It was the people who could not afford to get out of town, did not have the finances to own a car or the ability to secure safe passage out of the disaster zone. Personal support systems. Unfortunately, in Florida, we saw a lot of elders who basically were not responded to by their own families. Sometimes families came in and got their parents out of harm's way, and other times they were pretty much looking for the systems in Florida, which were already fragmented due to the disaster, to step in and take over and provide the care and services for the individuals that they would consider their parents. Perceptions, past experience, beliefs, very big tie-in, especially with certain areas. We would go into Mississippi, we'd be talking to individuals about getting out of harm's way, and they would say, well, I've lived through World War II, or I lived through this previous hurricane, or I've done this, or, we had a hurricane party the last time one came through. And they would not leave. And I can tell you stories about individuals who would, literally the police would come knock on the door, say it's a mandatory evacuation zone. They say they're not leaving. And the reason they're not leaving is because they're afraid if they leave, they're never going to come back because they're elderly. They're going to be stuck in a nursing home. Or all their personal possessions will be looted and taken should some damage occur. And so, there's a story about a gentleman where the police came, knocked on the door. He said, I'm not leaving. I don't care. You can arrest me, whatever. I'm not leaving. It's his right to stay. So they put the emergency, the search and rescue team symbol on his front door. And he said, what's that for? And the officer said, that's so the search and rescue teams know to come and look for your body after the storm comes through here, because your house is going to be washed away. Response and recovery. After the storm hits, we know the individuals are impacted, and we find that the ability to respond and recover to an actual impact of a weather-related event has a lot to do with their level of preparedness, access and or knowledge of emergency resources and funds. The FEMA system is very complicated. Learning how to, the only way that elderly individuals really truly can gain access to emergency federal funding programs and services is to get to FEMA or have FEMA come to them. And it's not that easy for a frail elder individual to do. There are long lines. I'm sure you've seen, if you've seen any of the disasters that played out on TV, the lines for water, the lines for registering for assistance programs. It's not easy. We try and make it easier by moving DRCs, the disaster recovery centers, to where individuals are most impacted and make it easier for them to get there. But still, when you're frail and elderly, you can't carry a case of water up 9 flights of stairs because you have no power and the elevator doesn't work. Information, a lot of inaccurate information, where to go, a lot of confusion, social isolation. Storms don't always hit populated areas. Even though Hurricane Katrina, most of the media attention focused on Louisiana, New Orleans, the real impact zone was Mississippi and rural Mississippi. Biloxi, the coastline, was completely devastated. New Orleans probably would have been fine had the levees helped. It would have been secondary wind damage, maybe a Category 2, 3-ish wind damage. But it was the levees and the water that destroyed the city of New Orleans. Mississippi, however, had a 20 to 30-foot storm surge, which pushed every person's home within a mile of the beach back about a mile. There was a debris pile twice the size of this room right here. Level of community and family support. A lot of individuals rely on their neighbors, their friends, their colleagues, their family to take care of them. And in a disaster, that breaks down. Your neighbor who checks in on you every day is gone. They went to New York to stay with their family. Now this individual is socially isolated, does not have the support systems in place. Willingness to accept assistance. A lot of people just say, I don't need your help, I'll be fine. And they refuse it. And it unfortunately puts them in harm's way. Fear of unknown. Again, if they leave their house, if they go to a special needs shelter, will I ever get back? How am I going to get there? How am I going to get back? Who's going to protect my property? And then there's different levels of resiliency, and there's a lot of factors that I won't go into, and I think Gloria will be talking about it tomorrow. The level of resiliency that a person has. One of the things that we learned from all of this, starting with 2004, is that the systems that are designed to care for people on a maintenance type system and those that are emergency response based were completely separate worlds. And when you collided these two worlds, they didn't talk the same language, they didn't use the same acronyms, and they did not know how each other functioned. Not only that, the emergency response organizations had no clue, because they're federal and they're from all over the country, they come to a disaster zone, they had no clue where the elderly people are. And the only people who know where the elderly people are the social services people, the folks that work with the elderly every single day. But they didn't know how to communicate to each other. Now, over time, this has changed. Now when you see a federal disaster in the United States, the first thing the federal agency says is, where is my aging network? Where's the state unit on aging within a state? And what happened was the states learned to work together. But it wasn't just the government agencies, the state agencies. It was also the NGOs, the social service providers, the state units on aging, the lead agencies, these other entities, as well as the private industry, all coming together to figure out how to work with each other, how to get things paid for, how to get the resources where they were needed most, to the places they were needed the most. I'll get it. So what did we learn? Older persons are disproportionately affected. There are, or were, and still are, limited disaster strategies and policies for older persons. They have changed. The state of Florida has made great strides, but a lot of areas that have not yet been impacted by disaster. And keep in mind, every single one of us lives somewhere where there could be a climactic change that causes an event that will affect us. A lot of places that don't get hit with disasters are not prepared for it. Florida, of course, being in a target zone, we have more policies and procedures than probably any other state with respect to disaster response and recovery. Older persons lack the resources to recover. That's a fact. Funding is needed. There's not as great a communication between governments and non-governmental organizations. We learned that vulnerable persons are often hard to find. They live in various different places. It depends on the actual place that is affected, whether it's a metropolitan area where you have elders in a 55-story building, or you have elders scattered throughout a rural area of Mississippi. Sheltering plans, inadequate, not appropriate for elders. We use schools. Unfortunately, a lot of our schools are sometimes elementary schools. The toilets are only this high off the ground. Imagine being 90 years old and having to use a toilet that is designed for a 5-year-old. Limited access to pre- and post-sheltering for frail elders, and a strong resistance to leave their home. These are just some considerations. Disasters are unique. Weather and climate change will affect different communities in different ways. You need to know where your seniors are to be prepared for them in the event of some sort of climatic event that causes you to go in and help them. You need to develop your policies and procedures, and you need to focus on your vulnerable populations, including seniors, not just children. Truly integrated response must include all stakeholders, from the disaster response side to the aging side. Communication, important. Disaster planning and responsibility is essential, but is often ignored. Personal planning is often ignored by seniors. It's unfortunate. We had 4 or 5 hurricanes come through, 4 hurricanes in 2004, another 2 more. When Hurricane Wilma came through, or not Wilma, Katrina, just grazed the Keys. Within 24 hours, there were long lines in Miami for water and ice after 7 hurricanes. You'd think that people would kind of be prepared. More education, of course, funding is needed. So I talk about the perfect storm. You got an increased senior population. You've got a lot of activity as far as climatic, weather changes. You're going to need a lot of cots. And this happens to be a picture of the largest special needs shelter ever assembled. It was assembled in Florida. in 2004. It was designed to hold 8,000 special needs shelter individuals. Anyone care to guess how many actually used it? 112. Nobody would leave their community to go to Orlando to ride out the storms. 112. And I won't even tell you how many millions of dollars went into that. Thank you.
That was a keeper. Amazing. I think there are so many lessons to be learned there. Yeah, thanks, George. Our next speaker is Mr. Conrad Galke. Conrad is principal of CSP Enterprises, a consulting business with a focus on strategy, planning, and communications. He has 30 years of experience with BC Hydro in a number of technical and management planning positions, including Director of Strategic Planning and Manager of Generation Planning. Conrad is an electrical engineer and has a Master of Science in Engineering from the University of Cape Town. He's a professional engineer and a life member of the Institute of Electronic Engineers. He's currently chair of the Executive Council of the Association of Suzuki Elders and is president of the Pacific Energy Innovation Association. He's adjunct faculty member of the Clean Energy Research Center at the University of BC. And his presentation is Climate Change, the Elders' Perspective.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Heather, and thank you for inviting me here today. About a year ago, I gave a talk at an elder's home, and it was quite interesting because it's the first time I have ever given a lecture and the audience were asleep before I even started. Anyway, climate change. Today's paper. It was 15 minutes of hell. We were buried. Joplin, Missouri, over 100 people killed. A tornado. It seems tornadoes are even more difficult to deal with than hurricanes. Hurricanes, at least you have some sort of warning. So, what is the elder's perspective? Three, we talk about experience of the past, concern for the future, and a desire to make a difference. This is by personal example, influencing others, and very importantly, telling their stories. I'm involved with a group at a church that has breakfast every month, and it's been a bad few months for funerals. So there comes an age when it's 4 funerals and a wedding. But anyway, we realized in going to funerals, you learned a lot about people that you didn't know, and you wanted to find out. Of course, too late. So we've got a program where we have people telling their stories. And the first in the series, first guy up, he was 93 years old. And we had no idea he was that old. But he was telling some stories about the Depression, Second World War, and we realized, get those stories. They're very illuminating. Suzuki Elders, who are we? You can read just point to the last sentence. Suzuki Elders listen, learn, share, and act through educating, communicating, connecting, and advocacy. That's who we are. What's our vision? And enlist grassroots support, further environmental awareness, and behavioral change. That's a theme that's running through today. Our goals, I'll just point to the last one as being pertinent to the discussion. Advocacy. Suzuki Elders, utilizing their elder perspective as a framework, advocate for effective national and provincial policies / actions on climate change. The situation, and we all know this. What are the levels? Well, you see in March 1952, it was 314 parts per million. In April this year, 393 parts per million. So that's increasing an average of 1.3 parts per million over the 60 years. But if you look, and here are some of the impacts of climate change: flooding, fire. You heard about Katrina. This is just this month, Slave Lake, Alberta. Those of you flown, that's a subdivision you can see sort of after that fire. And that came miraculously. No one was killed during the evacuation. How that happened, I don't know, but it was totally devastating. So let's look at the acceleration of atmospheric CO2. Remember 1.3 average? You look at the most recent decade, it's over 2 parts per million per year. So the threat. This is what James Hansen of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies said. So this question, are we, what about a tipping point? Why do these numbers matter? You see Hansen again in 2008 talked about the need to reduce what was then 385, we're now at over 390, to 350 parts per million. But that is a figure. In fact, there's a website, 350.org, which many of you may know about, which has a lot of information about the levels, CO2 levels. So then the big question, is the planet doomed? According to 350.org, the answer is no, but they suggest that we're in a danger zone. We're like people whose cholesterol has got a bit high. The suggestion is that there's still something you can do about it to return to safety. Okay, and I'm going to leave this slide up a little longer because this seems to be sort of the core question, the barriers to action. Last week, the Suzuki elders met with Dr. Suzuki, and we sort of had a bit of a roundtable discussion. And the big question was, why, in spite of all the evidence, is there such reluctance to take the issue seriously? Pointed out, for instance, that an SUV today has an average fuel consumption less than a Model T Ford, 17 miles per gallon compared to 25. So and yet, so the first thing is denial. And what people are sort of just not prepared to accept that this evidence presents a threat, and they sort of resist it. Misinformation, there is a lot of misinformation around, and there's no shortage of people who can be invited to the studios of choose your favorite news channel to sort of make a contrarian case in face of the figures. Financial interest in the status quo. Clearly, this is a big one. There are a lot of organizations that see their sort of financial interests threatened by an aggressive program to reduce carbon footprints. In Vancouver recently, there was a big proposal for a casino, and in the end it was turned down because the citizens protested, and the politicians backed off on what at one stage looked like a clear that was clearly going to happen. But the folks in favor of it presented this most persuasive case for why that casino should happen, and yet, as I say, fortunately, as far as I'm concerned, Vancouver decided it didn't want a mega casino. The election cycle horizon, about 4 years max. We've just gone through an election. Was climate change discussed? No. And in fact, there's some irony that Stefan Dion, the previous Liberal leader who tried to do something about it, was in fact sort of pilloried on that issue, and it sort of contributed to his replacement by someone who did even worse. But anyway, that's another story. Media misrepresentation. This isn't an intent to sort of bash the media across the board, but it's just to recognize that media enjoys they have to sell newspapers. There are stories, and I used to have worked for a newspaper, and it said, if it bleeds, it leads. So that very much that the here and now interest and sort of serious reporting about long-term issues was less of a priority. Resigned to the worst. The old adage, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die type of attitude, which is, why should elders be concerned about it? Because we can't do anything about it, so let's live our life in whatever consumptive way we've chosen. So that's somewhat resigned. What I call the wolf syndrome is that there have been situations, in fact, we had a wolf syndrome just last week. Somebody said the world was going to end. Didn't happen. But when you make dire predictions, and the predictions, sometimes dire predictions are made to get people's attention, but if they don't happen, you have a credibility problem. And then, I guess, finally, the absence of a sense of urgency. Because this is coming, this freight train, if you like, is coming to us at a fairly slow rate, people feel we've got all the time in the world. And that is not the case. The big question is, when does it? When is something going to happen about it, or what will it take to get that sense of urgency? And it comes in cycles. So this brings me to the Bali Action Plan, which was developed in 2008, and this provides a framework for meaningful responses: mitigation, adaptation, technology, and finance. And so I'll just take these one at a time as they affect elders. So what can elders do? Well, support initiatives which reduce our carbon footprint, clearly through measures of efficiency and conservation. Oppose actions and projects which perpetuate the fossil fuel paradigm. And being pragmatic, recognizing that the society may face difficult choices. It's one thing to be against nuclear power. But what are the alternatives? Or if you're generally agreed you're against fossil fuel, and people say, well, you can't do without coal-fired power plants. Well, sort of maybe nuclear is a more attractive option if you look at it. Putting my engineering hat on just for 10 seconds, there is a type of nuclear reactor that is fueled by thorium, which, if you just Google the thorium nuclear reactor, it's very attractive because, in fact, it doesn't produce plutonium. And that was one of the reasons it was not adopted initially with these nations, because they wanted the weapon grade plutonium. But so there is a version of nuclear power that might work, and that could make a difference. Adaptation. Developing individual preparedness plans for extreme weather contingencies. Well, the previous presentation told us all about that. Ironically, I won't be able to attend your conference tomorrow, next 2 days, because I'm going to an emergency preparedness conference where we'll be hearing about, amongst other things, the earthquake in Christchurch, New Zealand, and the impact of Hurricane Igor on Newfoundland. And in strategic planning, there's a tenet that says if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So becoming informed about our individual carbon footprints. The papers by Gary Hack and his colleagues that I read ahead of this had some very useful information there. And this is the sort of thing that you need to come along. And then examining our individual lifestyles and making adjustments to reduce our own carbon footprints. Elders and technology. Elders are traditionally seen as techno-peasants. However, that's not always the case. And so here we need to understand what technology can and cannot do, for that matter, in addressing the problem. Did you know that if everyone drove a Prius in North America, there would be no need to import oil. So replacing inefficient carbon-hungry appliances. We've heard a lot about heating. You can get some pretty efficient furnaces and boilers these days. Replacing that is a way of reducing the footprint. And then embracing new technologies which reduce our individual carbon footprints. And elders in finance. Eliminate oil and gas subsidies. And you see the figure there. Acceptance of a need to put a price on carbon, i.e. a carbon tax. As far as Suzuki elders are concerned, that is a good tax. You price carbon, it makes a whole lot of sense. In fact, we have one in British Columbia, and it could be argued that contributed to the demise of the previous premier. However, of all the things he did, we strongly believe he did the right thing there, and hopefully that legacy will remain. And then also understanding that cutting carbon is profitable for businesses and does not have to be a burden on society. There's a study by McKinsey and Company about just pointing that out. And McKinsey and Company are not known as necessarily as an environmental organization per se. And so it's also good business. Summary, an overwhelming majority of climate scientists accept that global warming and climate change are attributable to our use of fossil fuels. It's a human-derived activity. Elders can do something about it through material efforts to reduce their own carbon footprints. Elders have the vote, our grandchildren don't. So we have an ethical obligation to act politically. Elders can speak to power. Elders don't give a damn. And so they can do that. And then, collectively, elders can influence public policy. And maybe you spotted that on the way in. That's my cue to tell a final story. Before the recent royal wedding and all the hoopla in London, Piers Morgan was interviewing Sir David Frost, and David Frost, they covered his Nixon interviews, and he'd interviewed Prince Charles when he was a teenager. Then he was asked later on, what were his most notable interviews? And he said, I guess really Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. And he was clearly more focused on his interview with Desmond Tutu. He apparently accused Desmond Tutu, of being a total optimist. Apparently, Tutu objected. He said, I am not an optimist. Don't label me in that fashion. But he said, I am a prisoner of hope. And so that Latin is for hope and posterity. Thank you.
Okay, as our panel assembles, I wanted to give you one other example of lived experiences. It goes back to the trailer park that I was talking about. You saw a picture of an individually demolished trailer, but again, there were 5,000 of those manufactured homes that were all from somewhere between destroyed to completely damaged. When I finally got on site because of the multiple hurricanes and was taken to the hardest hit area, an elderly couple was remaining in this damaged trailer. And the first thing she did when I came to the door was she apologized for the conditions and circumstances of her trailer, and that the debris still remained all in her yard. And I asked her, encouraged her to kind of step out and have a look around, that she had no need to apologize. Everything was trashed. And I noticed that as she was speaking to me, who I assumed was her husband, was kind of pacing behind her back and forth in the trailer. And I started to inquire about how are you doing? Have you been able to reach your agent for insurance purposes, et cetera? And she began to tell me that she didn't realize it at the time, but her husband was beginning to show signs of Alzheimer's, and he took care of all of the affairs in the house, and he missed making that payment, so they had no homeowners insurance when the storm hit. And she could not recall if she had been to the offices that FEMA had set up on site yet or not. And then I asked, well, do you have children? And every time I asked a question, I should have stopped asking questions. I just saw her sink back a little bit more. And she says, and that again, this is now in the context of 4 storms having hit Florida in a matter of weeks. And she sunk back a little bit more, and I asked her, do you have children that have, and she goes, we have an adopted son who lives in New Jersey, but we haven't heard from him yet, with the emphasis on yet. Like she still had this hope that, and I'm going, where is the SOB? I'll go get him, And then I said, well, it was late in the day. I said, since you're not sure if you have been to the FEMA offices, why don't I return in the morning at a time that's convenient for you, and I'll take you there and we'll get that process started. And she thanked me very much and said that she had just recently learned that her husband had been diagnosed with cancer and she must take him to the Cancer Institute in the morning. So what that just kind of illustrates is so many layers, on that you're not just dealing with one issue, but multiple issues, in a circumstance like this. So with the time we have remaining here, I wanted to, before we open up to the audience, if anybody on the panel wanted to take a couple minutes and circle back to any point that they wanted to provide a little greater emphasis to, or that they had to skip over, I'd like to give you that chance. If not, we'll turn it to the audience. Any questions out there for them? Please.
Sorry, I heard from Gary that according to the results of some polling exercises you did, sort of routine findings, older people are increasingly less concerned about climate change. Maybe I misunderstood. But then thank you. Then I was just listening to Conrad, who gave me the totally different impression that in fact older people are concerned, older people think they understand the threat of climate change, and that there's a need for them even at their advanced age to do something about it. So I'm sort of somewhat confused, and it's personal, because I get invited to give a lot of talks, and a lot of those talks are to older people. But so, have I misunderstood you? Or is there a confusion in my mind?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, what I showed you was for 2010, a survey, and I think if I remember rightly, that was saying that people are concerned, but there's still a proportion of the sample that was not concerned about climate change. So I did do that survey, so I'll go back to the one that I did. In the one that we did, we found that there was concern, that concern decreased as people got older, partly because they felt that they couldn't really do much about it, or they didn't know enough about it. But what we haven't mentioned here is the whole issue about ClimateGate and how that has influenced public opinion. Some of the surveys suggested after ClimateGate that it hadn't influenced that much, but I know from my own personal experiences, more people seem to be a bit more skeptical of climate change. And I don't know whether it's a correct assumption, but most of the people I've seen who are I made the mistake of going in to argue on one of these blogger sites because they mentioned my name. So I thought I will go in, and I've never been. It's just awful. They tear you apart and tell you how horrible you are. And so they go into character assassination, and then you cannot argue with them, you cannot present any piece of information. And I'm sure from the people who were responding to me, a high proportion of those were retired, who had lots of time and lots of knowledge on their hands. So to your question, I think it depends on the sample that you take, but overall, from what we've learned is that the older you get, the probably less concerned because you're about climate change compared to being a bit younger because of the other issues that are going on. But I think it depends on the samples that you've taken out, what time you undertook the survey. Yeah? Do you want to?
Well, I guess I was speaking more for the Suzuki elders, and so we're a sample already, and we're looking to expand our numbers. And so what I was reflecting was some of the thinking that was going. So.
I'd like to add one more thought to that. The other thing, too, is that just to be aware of the fact that anytime you talk about 65 years and older, you're compressing all the older people together. So there's a difference between the young old, the old, and the oldest old. And so therefore you might get even more differences between those groups that, because of the compression, might give sort of conflicting responses. And obviously, the older people get, the smaller your cells are in terms of data. So there's some challenges with getting old samples.
Thank you. You wanted to go back with a question?
Yeah, I just wondered if Conrad could tell the audience something about the David Suzuki Foundation, because some people don't know who David Suzuki is.
Yeah. Well, David Suzuki is a geneticist. He's a communicator, a broadcaster. There's a program on the CBC, the Nature of Things, which he is the narrator for. So he has a career as a broadcaster. He was a geneticist at UBC. He also created the David Suzuki Foundation as a foundation to focus on environmental issues concerned there. Climate change, the fisheries resource, forestry are areas of particular interest. And the elders are associated with them, but we are expected to think sort of independently. So we will challenge the foundation from time to time on some of the issues that they take. And so the thought is that we bring experience. I hesitate to use the word wisdom with elders all the time because some of the world's worst bigots are also old folk, and so I think the idea is drawing on our experience and assisting it and trying to take action, and meaningful action is the key here. And even our expansion in the last couple of years as a result of a conference that we held, and we're trying to influence a larger group of this older cohort.
Let me ask a question to kind of keep this going. When a person my age or older or younger makes a commitment to reduce their carbon footprint, is that cost neutral? Or am I almost thinking in the context of we all volunteer one way or another, and you suddenly realize it costs something out of pocket to be a volunteer? Is it cost to reduce your footprint?
Well, I mean, I could say yes and no. The no cost is that if you use your travel, one of the things I have to own up to the fact that I was coming down today, I thought I'd better take public transit. Yeah, somebody may ask me how I came here. So thanks to this conference, I've reduced my footprint today, and it was a whole lot cheaper to go on the bus than the downtown parking. And I think travel is the one that's the big problem, and maybe Gary could say some more about that. That's the great dilemma, I think, for the younger, older set, and the younger elders, if you like. And but a thing like making a decision on installing a high-efficiency furnace or boiler is certainly one that I would encourage. It costs you some capital outlay at the front end, but you get over time as a payback, and you can feel good about it.
Well, I remember saying the same thing to an audience, and one guy said, "Well, I'll be dead and I won't be here to get the payback." because the payback is over 10, 20 years.
Right.
So that can be a disincentive if there's no grants available to help people.
Right on the front end, yeah.
Low carbon technology. But in terms of transport is a very big issue. And again, I remember we held, a part of our communication, we held a public debate called Climate Change Any Questions, where we had a panel of experts and the public could ask questions. And that was broadcast on local radio, and then people were calling in. And one lady, who was an older person, said that I have my daughter lives in France, I'm disabled, I cannot get on the train, I cannot go by public transport. So it's easy when we're thinking, and I've been in the university thinking, well, these people must change this, that. It's about what we said earlier about social context and understanding. And I think even as a researcher, we go to nice conferences, nice places, so I think we're all sinners together, and it's about understanding that, but also looking at the options, what is suitable for the people in their social context.
Okay, thank you. We had some questions up.
And Kathy.
Okay.
Yeah, my question was, several of the panelists mentioned denial in one way or another as a barrier, and George, you mentioned it as surprising to you that people line up for water and ice after the fourth hurricane of the season or whatever, they're still lining up. I just was curious if you have any insights about that, particularly that denial where, as educators, we like to believe that if you can create a reality for someone that's close enough to the reality to make them, say, understand the threat of nuclear weapons or the threat of forest fires or whatever threat you want. If you can create in them that sense that they could really happen to them, then, well, you're most of the way there in changing behavior. But what you suggest is that the actual hurricanes don't really change behavior.
Yeah, exactly. I would have thought, and I think everyone else would have thought, that when you don't have any kind of event for a very long, prolonged period of time, you become soft. You stop thinking about it. You stop worrying about it. And then, out of nowhere, something happens and you're caught off guard. Florida had multiple hurricanes. The entire state was basically declared, and yet a glancing blow by Katrina, and literally it was just like a thunderstorm. There were lines at FEMA stations. Now, I think part of it was criminal activity, free water, free ice. But I also believe it's because that maybe there's a little bit of, all right, we're done with hurricanes. We've had our share. It's not going to happen again. And it's just other people, it's just a lifelong set way of thinking. You just are raised to believe a certain way and act a certain way, and changing that's very difficult from anybody's perspective.
I mean, this is a little bit dangerous because of the relationship between Cuba and Florida, but Cubans do very well, right? They know how to survive hurricanes.
I will put it in the context that I'm familiar with. When I went to Mississippi, I was in a very rural section of Mississippi, and these individuals have very little. And they were able to cope with the loss of power for weeks upon weeks upon weeks. They were able to survive with the structure that they had around them. They were incredibly strong, incredibly resilient, and not willing to accept assistance. When Wilma hit Boca Raton, you would have thought the end of the world happened. Everybody was in crisis. Everyone needed help. It was a completely different perspective. And Wilma was a Category 2, maybe 3, when it hit Boca Raton. So I don't know about Cuba, but I can tell you that certain people are much more resilient and have the structure around them to respond and recover to a hurricane. And then other people become so dependent on the things that we have every day, like simple power, that when you strip that away from them, they're helpless.
Yeah. Yeah, he doesn't know about Cuba, but I know he is looking for some cigars, if anybody can help him out. Kathy?
I was just going to ask Gary and Conrad to say a little bit more about whether you've done any research or just from your experience
Personally, the kind of activities that I've done, we haven't really looked at the intergenerational aspect. But I have another slide where when we look at the population, and this is what we've done in the UK, you're able to profile the population on what kind of attitudes they have. For example, you could have people who think in climate change or green issues are important, but they're not thinking it's so enthusiastic. So with the intergenerational thing and the grandchildren, it will work for some people, but not for others. It's the same when we have the message of save money, reduce energy, save money. For certain people, if they're wealthy, saving money and on their energy bills is not that important. So I think to motivate the people to do it, you have to identify the right people. And the kind of study that we did when it was a neighbourhood, much more targeted social marketing and understanding the people you want to engage with better will hopefully be much more effective.
Our first goal relating to education and programs, that working from an elder perspective, Suzuki Elders provide environmental education opportunities for elders and youth. And so we believe there's a real opportunity there. And as we get more involved, the thought is that when requests come into the foundation for someone to make presentations in the schools, that this would be a good idea for elders. However, there's a requirement of competence that goes along with it. So it's just not you want to have good information, and you want to be sure that you present it in a balanced way.
Is there a requirement for leadership training around climate change to be able to speak or to be leaders in the community as well as experts on the topic?
The answer probably is yes, there will be, because this is one of the things in terms of our relationship with the foundation that has been held out as something that they say they would like us to do. What has happened, as so often is the case with organizations, you get a change at the helm, and we have a new CEO, Peter Robinson, and he sees that his view is that the elders are a material resource that the foundation can draw upon, and so we're in the early stages of that becoming a reality.
Do you have something to add? Yes.
Quick comment. We talked about the communication with seniors in terms of the adaptation a little bit in emergencies, and then on the other hand in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm really interested in what where the linkages might be between those communication functions. So, for example, one could argue that if you've got your heat alerts, you've got your Lyme disease pamphlets, you've got your air pollution information going out there, does one actually want to talk about climate change in those messages, or would it simply confuse people, or is it of benefit? The other thing to think about is if we're not talking about adaptation and climate change together, does that impact our communications with respect to reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And so I don't know what any of the answers are, but I do hear our discussion along two sort of separate tracks, and I guess I'd be curious in terms of if anybody has views about that.
Yeah, early this morning, I think when you were talking, up to now, I've only looked at, when we look at the triangle, champion, because that's my area that I'm coming from, is how older people can be champions to encourage others to be aware of the issue and to make behavioural changes. But when you were saying about the heat wave, then I thought, adaptation is another way that they can be champions for. So I agree about in terms of having the kind of heat buddy going to your neighbour. And we know that when, at least in the UK, when we had flooding, that threat, that natural event, brought the whole community together, and people were then knocking on their doors to see if the older people were okay. The same when we had snow, they were knocking on doors. So I think champions as, yes, in terms of mitigation, but also then in the future or to adapt to certain events. But I think one thing that we've missed, and what you said earlier about communities not being able to cope. I don't know if you've come across here about the transition towns movement, so we have that in the UK, and I think the way forward is how we can build communities that are low carbon, that have stronger community cohesion, that you can encourage people to not be so dependent on fuel, not be so dependent on food that from other sources. For example, in York and in the UK, we have this thing called Edible York or Incredible Edible, where green spaces are being used for producing food that the local people can actually go and eat. So I'm just thinking about further on in the future about building stronger communities that are much more resilient, but also has a greater community cohesion with all the people together.
Okay, and then we have to go to break to stay on task.
I was just going to say that as far as connections, disaster victims don't perceive that their actions across a lifetime have anything to do with what just happened to them. However, I don't have any fact to back that up, but I think everyone who watches disasters and the increased number of disasters that we seem to be seeing, I think we all kind of, including elders, think that we're somehow involved with causing it.
So one more quick comment from Deborah.
Does the transition town movement include not just the adaptive, like resilience in terms of networks, but trying to make sure plumbing is going to be resilient to flooding, especially a big issue in the UK? I mean, are they trying to actually be resilient to climate impacts as well as reduce their emissions?
From what I understand and the people I've been involved in, it's more about how raising awareness or peak oil of dependency on fossil fuels and demonstrating that. For example, in York, they have an energy house where people can go and they can see what kind of energy efficient installations they can have. But my criticism of the transition towns movement is that it's really preaching to the converted. It's the same people, and then maybe if you've worked in the environmental movement, when you have events, it's the same kind of people that come along locally, and it's always the same people. And I'm currently starting a new project called the Good Life Project, where we're trying to integrate not just environment, but with quality of life and well-being, and that's quite a challenge. And that includes how it's in a small community, how we can engage people in a care setting and in a residential. So I think when we've been talking about it, it's easy just to focus purely on older people. When to be inclusive, you need to integrate them into community as well. And that's my next project, so I'll report back if I succeed.